Good morning, everyone. I'm Shahidul Rahman, the Executive Director of the American Muslim Institution. I'm so glad to have all of you join us from all over the US and the world today. For those of you that are not familiar with AMI, American Muslim Institution, it's an organization focused on limiting the impact of Islamophobia, bigotry, and racism by working with all the stakeholders throughout the country. Our organization is primarily focused on working with media and journalists. They play a tremendous role on how stories are covered and whose stories are covered. In order to build a strong and pluralistic society, the work of the media is absolutely important and necessary. We saw this the last 4 years during the Trump administration. They hold the powerful accountable, they expose hypocrisy, and oftentimes are the last defenders of truth. And as we all know, there can be no justice without truth. This is not a universal American trait, but the role of journalism and journalists is universally critical. Today, we are fortunate to bring together a panel of amazing expert journalists and experts that will share their thoughts, insights on democracy in South Asia. But we also see broad throughways that connects what's happening with democracy in South Asia and how it impacts us in the US and trends throughout the world. As we transition into the program, I am so excited to introduce our moderator to the virtual podium. For those of you not familiar with Sabrina Siddiqui, she is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, DC, where she covers the Biden presidency. Prior to joining the Journal in 2019, she covered the White House and the 2016 presidential election at The Guardian. A graduate of Northwestern University, Ms. Siddiqui lives in Washington with her husband. Sabrina, you're up. You have to unmute yourself.
Always still getting used to Zoom, even though it's been about a year in this pandemic. Thank you so much, Shahid, for the introduction. Good morning, assalamu alaikum, and I appreciate this opportunity, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. We have a very distinguished panel, and I'm very excited to get to the discussion. But first, I just want to offer an overview of why we decided to hold this very important conversation. In recent years, in many countries that are still democracies, we have seen a rise of autocrats or strong rulers. We have seen that the rule of law, human rights, and democratic institutions are under threat around the world, including here in the United States, as we saw over the last 4 years. Now, since a large percentage of our members and their parents hail from South Asia, the American Muslim Institution decided to hold this webinar about the future of democracy in South Asia. Today, we will be focusing on Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. Now, as everyone knows, after a long and bloody struggle for independence, both India and Pakistan became independent countries as the British left the Indian subcontinent in August of 1947. Now, while the British were very effective at exploiting pre-partition India's natural resources for more than 100 years, they left the country with a functioning parliamentary system, strong civil service, and above all, a single language, English. Under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Abul Kalam Azad, and Dr. Ambedkar, India chose the path of a secular and constitutional democracy. India became a republic in 1950 and has held elections regularly at the local, state, and national level since then. Initially, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan also chose the path of parliamentary democracy with protections for minorities. At the time of its creation, Pakistan consisted of West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Pakistan adopted a constitution in 1956, declaring it as an Islamic republic. But Pakistan's democratic journey has been interrupted several times with military rule since its creation in 1947. In addition, Pakistan underwent a brief civil war, which resulted in the succession of East Pakistan as the new People's Republic of Bangladesh in 1971. While Bangladesh is also a parliamentary democracy, it has also experienced military coups. The restoration of democracy in 1991 has experienced relative calm and rapid economic progress, but still challenges on issues of human rights. With this brief background, let's get started. We have three internationally renowned experts who will give their views about the current status and Future of Democracy in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And after their presentations, we will open it up to Q&A and look forward to also fielding questions from our audience for our distinguished guests. I'll start first by providing a bio for our speakers. And at first, I just want to introduce them by name. We have Dr. Shahidul Alam. Apologies, I just had an error on my side and I'm pulling up their bios just now. But we have Dr. Shahidul Alam, we have Siddharth Rajan, and we have Shuja Nawaz. And I am going to provide a brief bio for each of them. So Shuja Nawaz is a political and strategic analyst. He is a distinguished fellow South Asia Center at the South Asia Center at the, sorry, he's a distinguished fellow and has served as at the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, DC. He writes for leading newspapers and the Huffington Post and speaks on current topics before civic groups at think tanks and on radio and television. He has worked on projects with RAND, the United States Institute of Peace, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Atlantic Council, and other leading think tanks on projects dealing with Pakistan and the Middle East. In January 2009, he was made the first director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. Mr. Nawaz was educated at Gordon College, Rawalpindi, where he obtained a BA in Economics and English Literature, and the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University in New York, where he was a Cabot Fellow and won the Henry Taylor International Correspondent Award. He was a newscaster and news and current affairs producer for Pakistan television from 1967 to 1972, and covered the Western Front of the 1971 war between Pakistan and India, as well as President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's visit to China in January to February of 1972. He has worked for the New York Times, the World Health Organization, and headed 3 separate divisions at the International Monetary Fund. We also have Dr. Siddharth Rajan, a journalist and founding father of the Wire News website in New Delhi. And he was until October 2013, the editor of the Hindu newspaper. He's an economist by training. He studied at the London School of Economics and Columbia University and taught at New York University before returning to India to work as a journalist. He is a recipient of the Shorenstein Award for Excellence in Journalism in 2018. And our first speaker, Dr. Shahidul Alam, is a photojournalist, teacher, and activist. He has been a photographer for more than 40 years, and his photographs have been published at almost every major Western media outlet. He has really shown the, I think, importance of civic service and through his work. He was arrested in August of 2018 and detained shortly after giving an interview to Al Jazeera and posting videos on Facebook that criticized the government's response to 2018 road safety protests. He has been recognized by humanitarian organizations for his work. And in 2014, he was presented an award by the President of Bangladesh. And in 2018, the humanitarian award from the Lucy Awards. So we are very excited to have this very esteemed panel, and I'm going to give each of them the opportunity to present some opening remarks on their part. And we will begin with Dr. Shahidul Alam. So thank you so much. And the floor is yours, Dr. Alam.
Well, thank you for having me. Let me give you a bit of a background. You already mentioned the birth of Bangladesh, and very soon after Sheikh Mujib Bangladesh and took over, really, we had a situation where in 1974 we had a famine. We also had a one-party rule, so that really became the first regression from democracy, if you like. Sadly, Mujib was assassinated in 1975. The entire family was killed, pretty much, except for Sheikh Hasina and her sister, who were out of the country. This followed by military rule, and then eventually General Hussein Muhammad Ishad, who was running the country. And as all these dictators do, come in as dictators would then get themselves elected. And, we've seen this pattern. Luckily, India has not had that, but certainly Pakistan and Bangladesh has. But the opposition parties got together and Ershad was forced to step down in December 1990. We had elections soon afterwards in the beginning of 91. The irony is that elections do not in themselves necessarily lead to democracy. And though Khaleda Zia was a democratically elected leader, she too went on her autocratic ways. But the good thing to remember is Bangladesh is pretty astute and they've always voted intelligently. So Khaleda Zia was voted out. Awami League came in, they did exactly the same. They were voted out, BNP came in again. This time they decided elections were not quite so reliable, so they rigged the elections. And then there were protests, massive protests, leading to the elections having to be retaken. And this time Awami League did win. And then during this period, both opposition parties to Ershad had decided that an incumbent government just wasn't reliable enough and couldn't be trusted to hold a fair. So they began a process where there would be a neutral caretaker government, which would come in for 90 days and hold a fair and free election. That was their one task. Once they did that, the new government would take over and the process would continue. And now both BNP and Awami League had by then discovered that a fair and free election did not lead to the results as far as they were concerned. So while BNP had rigged the elections earlier, Awami League went a little bit further. And in 2014, they decided they wouldn't go to a neutral caretaker government. BNP decided not to participate in those elections and of course didn't come in. Awami League won without a single vote being cast at that stage. And there was fuss of an election, but that didn't really matter. The next election that was to come in, which was in December 2018, was one where BNP decided they would participate. It was shortly before that I started on a student protest. That was when I got arrested. This was just prior to the elections, so not a good time for dissenters to be let loose, to be talking about all the things that were going wrong. So I got arrested and tortured. I spent 107 days in detention. But what happened was there was international pressure and eventually I was released after my bail being refused 5 times. I got released on the 6th, but elections were completely rigged, and it's known by everyone in Bangladesh that no election actually took place. The ballot boxes were started on 9th of December 2018, but of course, Awami League came in, a landslide victory predictably, and since then, they've had full spectral control. So the police, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, everything is completely under their control, and that's been part of their problem. So what they also did was introduce the Digital Security Act, which is a draconian law. There had been an earlier law in place, which was the ICT Act, which was information communication and related to information technology. But the DSA really put in all the things, all the wrong. The government said it had nothing to do with journalists, but in fact, it's precisely journalists who've been arrested. So if you give you an idea, in 2000 nearly 700 arrests were made, 45 in January, over 90 in February, and it's just continued in that way. But throughout all this, COVID-19 came in, and that really became another opportunity. Now, it's commonly felt that the information about COVID-19 infections was suppressed in Bangladesh as the news would have dampened the planned celebrations for the 100th anniversary of the father of the nation, which happened to be Mr. Dad. Now, this was due on the 17th of March 2020, so no bad news could come out before that. Predictably, the first reported death was on the 18th of March 2020. Probably no coincidence. But the planned celebrations were toned down. Then there were a series of drastic steps which resulted people begging for food, even in affluent parts of Dhaka city, massive corruption in the health sector and the distribution of relief food, and a huge number of rapes. In fact, it's worth mentioning that on that 2018 election, there was a woman who was gang raped because she voted the wrong way. And really, that's pretty much symptomatic of the way things have gone. The government responded by arresting journalists and activists who commented on these matters. Very recently, Al Jazeera did a major expose, and one would have thought that an expose like that would have been on every headline. It wasn't on a single reported on a single television station. What they did was try to make up for it by the government actually sent out a rejoinder to this news, to this expose, which wasn't featured in the public domain, except in social media, where people found their own ways of getting to it. So we had this strange situation where newspapers were reporting on the rejoinder without actually having reported on the report itself. They used it intelligently. And that was going on. Within that, there was talk about how the chief of staff's brothers had come to visit in Bangladesh while they were on a trial. And then it transpired that they had been curiously pardoned without anyone having known about them. And of course, the government got its knickers in a twist trying to unpack these stories because they had to make up all these stories, and obviously it didn't fit. But more recently, Mushtaq Ahmed was a writer, Kishore was a cartoonist. They were arrested last May because they had put out they'd been critical of the regime, particularly of the COVID-19 treatment by the government. The government actually then sent out a gazette which made it effectively illegal to be questioning government officers unless you happen to get permission from the government in order to do so. So we had this Kafkaesque situation. But both Mushtaq and Kishore had their bail turned down 5 times, 6 times in fact. And on the 23rd of February, bizarrely died in jail. The day before, they'd gone to court, and on that day, or maybe it was 2 days, I think it could have been 23rd of February, Kishore had mentioned that he'd been tortured, but Mushtaq didn't make an accusation of that form. And then, of course, there was a public cross, and then the government cracked down on the protesters. They arrested 7. One of the directors of the RIC was injured in the police attacks. A large number of people were injured. And then Shaw was being brought to court. We were expecting that the government would finally come to its senses and he would be given bail. Instead of being given bail, the police actually asked for him to be put on remand, which is a Bangladeshi euphemism for state-sponsored torture. Thankfully, the court denied demand, but Kishore is in jail. So we've got this incredible situation where one person has just died after having been refused bail 6 times, and the brother of the chief of staff who'd been accused of murder have been pardoned by the same government. So the common joke now is, in order to get bail, you need to have been a murderer. They're the only ones who get pardoned. So that's roughly where we lie right now. And of course, there's no freedom of speech whatsoever. And there is fear across all camps. And for me, the biggest danger is the fact that the people who would normally be speaking at a time like this, the intellectuals, the artists, are all quiet. There's this deathly silence, and the media itself, with some notable exceptions, have essentially become extensions of the government's propaganda machinery. let's leave it at that, and we'll come back later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alam. That was very insightful, and we look forward to getting more into some of these points as our discussion continues. Our next speaker is Mr. Siddharth Rajan, and thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I'll try to limit my remarks to 10 minutes because I think the more time we leave for questions from the audience, I see we have more than 100 people, which is great, the better it will be. So, you know, this panel is looking at the future of democracy in South Asia, and my brief is to speak about the situation in India. And I would say that, you know, India is, India as an electoral democracy today faces a crisis of democratic values and democratic institutions because of willful deviations from fundamental constitutional principles by the government of the day that are not being challenged by the very institutions whose mandate it is to act as custodians of those principles. This, in a nutshell, is the problem we face, that you have a functional electoral democracy, you have a government which has, you know, a full support in parliament, and is treating that parliamentary majority as sort of a mandate to effect sweeping changes in the way the country is governed, even though many of these changes are actually run counter to the basic structure of the Constitution. And I will just run through, you know, one could have a very long list, but I will just focus on 6 particular changes or deviations from fundamental constitutional principles that affect the quality of democracy and that, you know, bother me in particular, and which, you know, and these concerns are shared by a large number of people in India. And the first of these principles from which the government is deviating is secularism, which we understand to mean not just that the state has no religious affiliation, but that the state, but that citizens or citizenship, the rights that go with being a citizen are regardless of the religion that a citizen, you know, bears. And deviations from this principle are rampant in the kind of laws that are being passed, the kind of emphasis being placed to sectional demands and issues. For example, laws that many states under the BJP have enacted, draconian laws to criminalize the slaughter of cattle, and or laws that now increasingly a number of states are passing to make it very difficult for interfaith marriage, essentially criminalizing the you know, making it easy for charges to be leveled against particularly the grooms when they are Muslim, if they marry or are romantically involved with Hindu women. And this stems from a ludicrous kind of demographic insecurity on the part of the ruling party. And then you have the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed a year and a half ago, which for the first time introduces religion as a criterion for granting a resident of India citizenship. So essentially, India is home to many undocumented migrants Many of them are refugees under the definition of a refugee in international law. But under the Citizenship Amendment Act, only those refugees or undocumented migrants who are non-Muslim will be eligible for Indian citizenship, even if they enter the country without valid papers. And when this CAA, as it's called, is coupled with an absurd proposal to create a national register of citizens, in other words, to essentially subject every person in India to the requirement that they prove their citizenship in some way through producing documents that the state will list out. This has clearly led to fears among many Indian Muslims that what's being attempted is some attempt at stripping them of citizenship or perhaps of disenfranchisement as an intermediate step. And there are many other examples one can give of deviations from the secular principle, but I'll leave it at that for now. Second, deviation from the principle of federalism. The official name title for India is India is the Union of India, and even though the federalism that we have in India is rather different from that of the United States or Canada or other countries, every country has its own system. But here there is a very clear division between powers that vest with the central government and those that vest with state government. I won't go into too many details, but I'll just give one example. The unilateral manner in which the central government moved to abolish statehood for the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and then to arbitrarily and unilaterally partition the state into two separate, what are called union territories, and to deprive the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh of their own elected legislatures. It's now been more than a year since Article 370 was read down, and the people of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh do not have elected representatives, and there's no word for when this may actually change. But the fundamental thing is that they have been deprived of their statehood in a manner that I believe runs completely counter to the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, where a challenge to this change was laid, has so far refused to begin proper hearings of this issue. The third principle which is being violated or which is under challenge, fundamental constitutional principle, is freedom of speech and conscience, and linked to that, freedom of the press. There are numerous examples from around India as to people getting jailed, having all kinds of crazy charges flung against them simply for expressing dissenting opinions or being critical of the government. I myself am subject to a couple of criminal charges for doing my work as a journalist, and there are lots of other journalists who have similarly been charged. You may be familiar with the recent case of Disha Ravi, a young environmental activist from Bangalore, 22-year-old woman who took part in solidarity protests in support of India's farmers who are agitating against some new laws that the government has introduced. I won't go into the merits or demerits of that. But this young woman was accused of sedition simply for having edited a Google document which speaks of different ways in which people in India and around the world can peacefully show solidarity with the protesting farmers. And even though it was very clear from a plain reading of this document that there was no call to violence, there was nothing illegal about it, yet the police goes to her house, drags her all the way to Delhi and charges her with sedition, which is a charge that can only be sustained if it's linked to the actual promotion of violence. And this young woman was charged and of course finally released on bail, but those cases against her will obviously continue. And there are many other people like her, and there are many other examples that I can give which show that in India today we are facing a real crisis when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of the press. I should also add that the unexplained and lengthy detention of political leaders in Jammu and Kashmir after the reading down of Article 370 is also part of this pattern, of the violation of fundamental rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. The fourth principle, which is under challenge, democratic principle, is I would say, the freedom of assembly. It's becoming increasingly difficult in virtually all parts of India for people to peacefully protest without having their protest being criminalized in some way or penalized by the state in some way. And this is quite apart from the way in which the ruling party, in association with sections of loyal media, will try to paint peaceful protest as somehow seditious and anti-national, laying the groundwork in terms of building public opinion against people in order for more draconian measures that the state may then take. The fifth fundamental principle, which is under challenge, is, I would say, the principle of free and fair elections. India used to take pride in the fact that it had an independent election commission that vigorously enforced the principle that you have to have a level playing field at election time. Today, there are many reasons to question the behavior and conduct of the election commission. Its refusal to enforce guidelines on what is permissible in terms of campaigning. If those guidelines are violated by the Prime Minister or by a leading ruling party politician, the election commission is more likely than not not to find them guilty of that. And there are examples from the 2019 election involving Mr. Modi. And associated with this issue of elections is a very opaque method of election financing that the Modi government introduced, which is of allowing corporate houses to donate money anonymously through electoral bonds. Now, this has now drawn a veil over political financing. So we know, for example, that the Bharatiya Janata Party has an election war chest that is 2 or 3 times bigger than all the other parties put together. But we no longer know, and the party does not have to declare, and nor does any company that's donating money have to declare, that it has given money to this party. So this lack of transparency essentially allows, in my view, crony capitalism to flourish, because a company can strike a deal with the party and donate money anonymously. That's not known to the public, but of course the fact that the party has received money from the company is something that the two parties themselves would know. And I think this lowering of this putting, covering election finances with a veil is, again, something which is very harmful to democracy. And the Supreme Court, despite challenges being made in the form of petitions, the Supreme Court has not so far bothered to take this up with any sense of urgency. The last deviation from constitutional principles that I would like to mention, because it's important in its own way, may not be the most burning issue, but we are enjoined by the Constitution of India, the government is enjoined to promote what's called the scientific temper, which is that you create a rational society which respects, scientific principles. What we have of late is the promotion of quackery, the promotion of mumbo jumbo, whether in the name of the holy cow or in the name of us making all kinds of tall claims about ancient Indian wisdom, and by all means, and the irony is that even as the current government insists that ancient Sanskrit texts are full of wisdom, they do this more as a kind of empty boast, as a chauvinist boast. If you ask them how many ancient Sanskrit texts, which are not known to us because of lack of translation, how many of those texts have you actually translated into Hindi or English so that they can be widely read and disseminated? The answer is 0. This using of superstition and we saw even in the case of COVID, the health minister shared a platform with a god man who has his own so-called pharmaceutical company promoting Ayurvedic remedies. And in this press conference, they basically lied that here we have a remedy that can deal with COVID symptoms. And finally, the WHO was forced to issue a statement saying that this is not on. And then the health ministry had to dissociate itself from that. So I think this violation of scientific temper, recently there was a government order that said that for any public university to have a Zoom discussion on topics that relate to India's internal affairs, they need prior government permission if they're going to invite foreign scholars, before doing this, which is a completely I don't think even Iran or North Korea has tried pulling off this kind of a stunt. So the scientific community protested and the government withdrew that order. But that just gives you a taste of the kind of things that they get up to. So I'll stop there. These are the 5 or 6 things that bother me. And I'll be happy to take questions and elaborate on these or any other issues that your audience may have.
Thank you so much. And I know there's so much food for thought there, and we will definitely have some Q&A where we will get more into a lot of the topics that you raised, and just wanted to give a little more time for our final speaker, last but not least, Mr. Shojan Nawaz, to deliver his remarks, and then we will dive right into that Q&A. So Mr. Nawaz, please do take the floor.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, and thank you to the American Muslim Institution and to my fellow panelists for having laid out essentially what appears to be a rather tragic and sad story of the current state and perhaps the future of democracy and freedom in South Asia. South Asians, as you well know, tend to be very argumentative, and they're not given to much self-criticism or introspection, but there's often a resort to what I call a narrative of victimhood, where the whole world seems to be conspiring against them. And that seems to be reflected in a lot of the decisions and the discussions that take place, particularly in the corridors of power in South Asia. Now, as the opening remarks, as well as your opening remarks, as well as the comments by both Shahidul Alam and Siddharth indicate, it's been a struggle since 1947 in India and Pakistan, and of course the struggle between the internal conflict between democracy and authoritarianism gave rise to the birth of Bangladesh. Unfortunately, as Shahidul explained, Bangladesh didn't learn the lessons from its own bloody history of independence, and so is subjecting its own people now to some of the horrors of authoritarianism from time to time that they complained about before 1971. The other thing worth mentioning is that, of course, the region is probably overdiagnosed. Everybody knows what the issues are, but it's still worth pointing out. And I would strengthen the comment made by Shahidul Alam initially. And I think Siddharth also made this point, that elections by themselves don't necessarily assure a democracy, because there are elections and elections. And they have to be free and fair. And in my view, they have to be frequent. So in Pakistan, for instance, there seems to be a kind of God-given right of every government that is elected, that it has 5 years to rule. And they keep taking their chances one by one while eating off the public trough. I'm going to list some major symptoms of the problem that afflicts the region and particularly Pakistan. Then I'm going to talk about what is needed and then what we can do about it. Major symptoms, as far as I can see, are first, an institutional and political and economic conflict between the center and the periphery, which means that the center, despite the fact that Pakistan was supposed to be a federation, as India is supposed to be a federation of the states of the Union, Pakistan, the center has always tried to grasp all the power and has only grudgingly released it, even though constitutionally one of the civilian governments enacted rules that allowed the provinces some of those powers. The bureaucracy has now been fighting tooth and nail in order to retain their control over many of those functions. So that's a big issue which is affecting democracy and freedom within the country. Secondly, there is an internal struggle between power centers in Pakistan, the civil versus the military. After a very long time of this conflict between a civilian government and a military, which pretended to be, quote unquote, on the same page, and in a glib commentary, I once said that maybe they were on the same page, but in different books. You now have a situation where you have what I call essentially a misalliance between a civil government and the military. It is a marriage between very unequal partners, and it is not going to last. I don't think one needs to be a brilliant political scientist to predict the downfall of an unequal partnership. Similar to the relationship between Pakistan and the United States, which was an unequal misalliance and therefore has so many ups and downs. So you have also a conflict between the feudals who initially took over after Mr. Jinnah in the history of Pakistan and have wanted to retain power against the rising new class in the cities. And Pakistan is now predominantly an urban country, but this fact is not being recognized. And even the latest census, surprisingly, doesn't show an overwhelming majority of Pakistan as being urban, because that would have changed the political constituencies and the map of the country in favor of the cities. So you have the urban elites versus the feudals. This battle continues to go on. Another symptom of the disease that afflicts the country is dynastic politics. Now, this is not confined to Pakistan alone. In Bangladesh, you have two parties that are essentially run by ladies who have a dynastic link, in one case of the government to the founder of Bangladesh, in the other case to a dictator who took over the country by force. So in Pakistan too, as well as in India, you have very powerful dynastic groups that run political parties. But in Pakistan, this is exacerbated by the fact that almost all the major political parties are dynastic, except for Imran Khan's PTI, which has members of the dynasties in it, because it is essentially a party of political turncoats that he could draw to his party, because they were the so-called electables that were seen by him and his supporters in the military who wanted to replace the previous dynastic parties. But as we get prepared now for the Senate elections, you're seeing a return of much of the making and breaking in backroom deals between the civil, the military, and the various political parties. We don't know what the end result will be. Another point with understanding in the context of Pakistan's struggle for democracy is that there has been cultivated over time what I call, in my first book, Cross Swords, and in the new book, The Battle for Pakistan, I call the culture of entitlement, where legalized entitlements and privileges for both the civil and the military have created entrenched interests and intrusion into each other's territories. So there are economic and political advantages to this. And of course, as I mentioned, India has been spared, and Siddharth also mentioned India has been spared military rule, but Bangladesh inherited and continues to copy the Pakistan model. The recent report that was mentioned by Shahidul Alam about the Al Jazeera investigation, as well as the Economist report, highlights that particular aspect. So there is a greater degree of civilian control of the military in Bangladesh, but the military and the civilian are essentially aiding and abetting each other. And finally, something that has been mentioned by both the previous speakers, assaults on freedom of expression and assembly. So the use of officialdom, and this is most striking that, more than 70 years after independence in the subcontinent from British rule, we are still employing anachronistic British colonial era laws to curtail political freedom. So what's the best way to get rid of this issue or these issues? In my view, the best disinfectant remains sunshine. So transparency and accountability are critical. And they are necessary because the people demand it. It's not because do-gooders like me are sitting in the United States. It's a delicious irony that people in Trumpistan are talking about freedom and democracy in South Asia. It's not because of that, but it's because that's what people want. They want their voices heard, whether it's the farmers, right or wrong, they want their voices heard. Whether it's the minorities in India, right or wrong, they want their voices heard, whether it's the Baloch or the Pashtun or the Sindhis or the rural communities in the Punjab or in Gilgit and Baltistan in Pakistan, they want their voices heard and their votes to count. So transparency and accountability are critical. And this has to be across the board. You can't have sacred cows. You can't say, oh, this institution will monitor itself and we will take its word for it, which is what happens in Pakistan. I think it's critical to gain the respect and retain the respect of the people of Pakistan, who have constantly come out and voted for civilian governments and military governments alike, with the hope that they will get what they need, which is better governance and growth and prosperity and jobs, which is Pakistan's biggest problem at the moment, which is economic. The other thing that is needed, of course, is digital access and education. Education has been left largely to the private sector. The government sector has failed miserably. It has relied on foreign aid, which is often misplaced and which is often leaked into the pockets of the elites that deal with the aid agencies and the NGOs. Digital access is, as in the United States and in other countries, limited by your economic standing. So if you're poor, you're not going to be able to have digital access. You can't find out knowledge or information for yourself. Neither can you use that access to coalesce with others who are similar to you in thinking and take action together. So what you need is a change in the situation. You need a new world where government, which unfortunately can buy the worst weapons or the best of the worst weapons to monitor communications in order to control their youthful populations that are constantly connected with the world outside and are trying to find ways of bypassing the digital controls and electronic media controls that the government has at its disposals. So there is some optimism on this front. I don't want to sound too negative a note, because one thing that every successive government, particularly in Pakistan, has discovered, that it is very tough to govern an ungovernable country in an interconnected world. You can't shut off the country from the rest of the world, and therefore you can't shut off ideas from coming in and then being picked up and being taken over and owned, particularly by the largely youthful population of the country. Myanmar is a very good example of that, and we haven't mentioned that in our discussion today, but what we are seeing there is a population that is standing up to the military. And by coming out into the streets, they're showing the ineffectiveness of military weaponry against ideas and the desire for freedom and democracy. Now, what are the tests ahead? Very quickly, and Siddharth mentioned the Disha Ravi case. In India, this is going to be a very interesting litmus test on what happens, also what happens with the farmers' protests in general. But upcoming state elections in 4 major Indian states, Assam, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, are going to determine to what extent the BJP actually does have power in the states. And the reality is that it has been losing that power over time, and the center has been increasingly losing political power to the states of the union. In Bangladesh, the treatment of Shahidul Alam and others who questioned the current government in public, and the emergence of charges of corruption against the army chief in the Al Jazeera report are going to be interesting tests to see if they are picked up by the non-official media and by the social media, and they permeate back into the country from the international media. In Pakistan, Senate elections this week, against the backdrop of video evidence of the actual buying of votes in the last elections, and the government's resort to presidential ordinance to force open voting for the Senate seats, which is against the principle of secret ballots, in order to essentially control their own party members from being bought over, and for reducing horse trading, which afflicted the Senate elections in the past. That is going to be a very interesting test. But it doesn't look very bright, because in the largest and most populous province, Punjab, all the Senate nominees have been elected unopposed. This is an unbelievable story coming out of a country that wants to call itself a democracy. And why were they elected unopposed? Because the opponents were disqualified, or because they were persuaded by some mechanism, institutional or otherwise, to withdraw. So that doesn't bode well. The bad sign, this is a bad sign in my view. Looking at the issues related to disappeared persons, and also the issue of a maverick judge of the Supreme Court, Judge Faiz Issa, who has been critical of the military. It'll be interesting to see if this man, who may become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court on September 18, 2023, for 13 months, and who is considered to be a bête noire, particularly of the military, if he survives, then maybe democracy will survive. If not, then the outlook remains very cloudy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nawaz. Really appreciate your time and your remarks, which give us a lot of food for thought as we move into our discussion. And we'd love for all of you to take the opportunity to respond to one another's points. And just to kick it off, I'll say you all have touched on similar themes with respect to, crackdown on freedom of speech, concerns over treatment of ethnic and religious minorities. You've talked about, military rule and the civil society's reliance on them. So I want you all to kind of reflect on, and perhaps Dr. Alam, you can kick us off. To what would you attribute this democratic backsliding? And Mr. Nawaz raised some important points about need for transparency and accountability. What are some other mechanisms through which you think the tide can be reversed?
Well, firstly, I think one of the problems is that the parties do not have an exit clause. They come in with the idea that it's a winner take all, and because they behave the way they do, they know that they will actually be ravaged when they're not there. Therefore, it's hanging on at all costs, which has come to an extreme level at the moment. If the party was to leave, they would have to leave the country in order to stay alive, because there's just so much anger, and they know that. So that obviously makes the thing difficult. But what's happened in the process is this complete controls, full spectral control they have over all state organs, the police, the judiciary, even the academia has been so well controlled. It's very difficult. And I'll give you an idea of how effective this is. I mean, Professor Yunus, the Nobel laureate, is one of the best known Bangladeshis internationally, and certainly well known within Bangladesh. When the government went against him, they were able to do it without too much trouble. Khaleda Zia, we thought was, this is the leader of the opposition of one of the largest parties. We felt she could not be put in jail. There would just be too much, but they did it. And then the Chief Justice was sent on exile. away with all of this, and really that level of control makes it very, very difficult to see how we can get around it. But there is a very serious climate of fear for justifiable reasons. I mean, there's been crossfire, there's been disappearances, there's torture. You know, there are these midnight raids that you know about, and of course, someone like me getting arrested does get attention, but there are people dying every day, and it doesn't appear. They never make it to the headlines. I would actually like to bring in something which hasn't been discussed at this point, and that is the elephant in the room. Now, obviously, we know about India and Pakistan, and the strife between them. What isn't known about is the role that India plays pretty much across the region, but India's interference in Bangladesh. The water sharing treatment, of course, was never recognized or respected. But I'll give you a little example. Abrar Fahad was an engineering student in one of the top universities. He critiqued a particular deal being made where he felt India was getting an advantage. He was brutally killed in campus. Basically, they bludgeoned him to death, taking a break to watch a football match and then coming back to finish it off. And this sort of thing continues. The border killings that goes on in India is something that people are up in arms against, yet there's nothing they can do about it. But the reason this happens is because the government is so beholden to India for its own survival that it will give in to whatever India needs, because that's how it has to survive. Now the equation is changing somewhat because China is flexing its muscles. So, the government is trying to play India and China. At the end of the day, what happens to us? And really, it's become very, very problematic. We've also got situations where the control of the textbooks, the narrative that is being presented, history is sacrosanct. You cannot question certain figures. You cannot question certainly the leaders. And in terms of the level of censorship there is, not only are people scared, juveniles have been jailed because they've critiqued the prime minister. So we really have a ridiculous situation. And for me, the biggest challenge really is, even as much perhaps as what the government is doing, is deal with the silence of the intellectuals. The artists who've traditionally been very forceful, very forthright, are quiet today. The intellectuals are quiet today. And to a very large extent, the media is completely subservient. And that gives us very few options. And the fact that the government needs to cling on because they have no other choice really gives very little options to anyone.
Yes, and Mr. Varadarajan, what would be your response to that? Because Dr. Alam raised the issue of India in particular, and did you want to respond to any of the points that he made? I think you're on mute. If you, oh, there you go.
Yeah. I would say, from my point of view, actually, Bangladesh. We are constantly astonished by how the government of India sees the Hasina government in Bangladesh as a valuable ally in the region, and at the way Shahidul says, is prepared to back the government no matter what. But what is, from my point of view, what is alarming is the ease with which the ruling BJP can use pretty nasty political rhetoric against Bangladesh and Bangladeshis for domestic political purposes, right? So, so even as the Modi government is quite happy to go along with whatever Sheikh Hasina does domestically, and I would say the border issues and the behavior of border guards is an older issue. I think that it predates Modi. And I don't think things will change that easily, regardless of which party is in power in India or Bangladesh. It's the nature of South Asia that border management is pretty nasty business. And so if we set that aside for a minute, I would say that the reference that the entire politics. I mean, I mentioned the addition of the religious dimension to the Citizenship Act. The entire rhetoric there is aimed at painting the whole of Bangladesh and all Bangladeshis as, in political parlance in India, the phrase infiltrator is used to describe an undocumented migrant from Bangladesh. So this image is conjured up of Bangladeshis who are coming to India in millions in order to wreak havoc. And, whereas anybody who's coming here is coming here to work, just as Indians go abroad, many of them undocumented, right? So this is a problem. But I would say from a geopolitical point of view, we aren't really focusing on foreign policy here, but I would say that the Modi government has messed up relations with all of its South Asian neighbors. And, I would include Bangladesh in that.
Mr. Nawaz, you were talking about some of the ways in which you believe that democracy can be strengthened, not just in Pakistan, but also in India and Bangladesh. You mentioned transparency and accountability. How do you implement transparency and accountability in Pakistan?
I think you do that by allowing freedom of expression and free flow of information, and by removing the direct as well as many indirect ways in which media are controlled by both the civil and the military. I think this has become big business in Pakistan. So there's penetration of the communication business by the military in Pakistan. There's control through advertising revenues and through control of access to information about a civilian government. So certain media outlets may be favored and others are not. But I want to make 2 or 3 very quick points, I think, which I see from some of the chatter coming across in our chat box questions that may be worth responding to, because those are relevant. One, of course, is that political parties internally are not democratic. They don't hold elections. They select people, and then they complain about a selected prime minister in terms of Imran Khan. Except for the Jamaat-e-Islami, none of the political parties actually holds elections. Imran Khan promised to hold elections, tried it, and discovered what a mess it was. And so he put an end to it at the very beginning of his term as prime minister. So that's one thing I think that would help, because that would show that what they talk about, they believe in, and that the people can have confidence in them. Then in terms of India's role, I think India plays a very critical role because it's a huge economy, it's a huge society, and it's the largest neighbor in the neighborhood. And so as India goes to the right, as to the extreme right, particularly, as Siddharth was also indicating, it has an effect on the neighboring countries. In Pakistan, it is going to strengthen the hands of the extreme radical Islamist and the right wing, because they will say, see, we told you so. India is doing this because India wants to remove Pakistan from the map of the world. And the only way we can protect ourselves is if you give us the power to mobilize the same religious forces, similar to the way India is doing. Between India and Bangladesh, the problems predate the Modi government. But I think a critical element in this is going to be always the government of West Bengal, because the old cultural, economic, even political ties between the people of Bangladesh and West Bengal could be strengthened by having a much more open border and an easier traffic of workers so that they can complement each other. That's not happening, and I don't know, maybe Siddharth can shed some light on what he expects from the West Bengal government. I know that at one point, they did stop the Farakha barrage agreement from being signed at the last minute because they disagreed with it at that time. So what influence does the West Bengal government have on that particular relationship? Let me just stop there.
Thank you. We are getting some great questions in the chat, so we encourage you to keep them coming. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and combine some of the points that we're seeing from our audience with some of the questions that we've seen that we had ourselves for our various distinguished guests here. One of our viewers points out that democracy is certainly the desired system. Bangladesh is, however, making economic strides under its flawed model. Pakistan is not. India is a mixed bag. What should people in the region make of this? And I think this is something that also ties to an argument that you often see in developing countries, which is that you see defenders of the system say that these societies are not actually fit for democracy, that they would rather see autocratic rulers to grow and lift their economy. Dr. Alam, what would you say to that, especially since, as one of our viewers pointed out, Bangladesh, despite its flawed system, is making economic strides? And you're on mute, so if you don't mind unmuting yourself, sir. Thank you.
I think it's undisputable that Bangladesh has made economic gains. It's made gains in many, many other sectors. I'm of the opinion that it's made those gains despite the politicians, not because of them. If you think in terms of where these gains have come from, the large part of the strength of our economy are the migrant workers, are the garment workers, are the farmers. We have a population of 170 or so million being fed by our farmers. It's on the other hand, you've got a huge outflow of wealth from our country going to foreign banks, setting up cities in Canada, my second home in Malaysia. So and while all this has been happening, the economic disparity within Bangladesh has grown bigger than pretty much anywhere else. So, I mean, that's not to decry the things that have happened, recognize that. And certainly, economic growth is something to be lauded, without a doubt. But at the end of the day, it is the poor of Bangladesh that really needs to have a better life, a better option. Having a few much more wealthy people might well look good on GDP on paper. At the end of the day, it does make a difference to the person on the street, and that's really what we thought about.
And Mr. Rajan, we have a question that kind of follows up on a lot of the points you made about the Modi government, the way in which it has arrested its critics, whether it's activists or journalists. Obviously, we have also seen the persecution of religious minorities, especially Muslims. Is there any effective opposition within India to arrest this movement and to turn the tide in terms of the democratic blacksiding that we have seen, especially in Prime Minister Modi's second term?
Well, there's plenty of opposition. I didn't mean to depress people too much, and I'm glad this question has come up because whether I mean, the most recent example is the protest, which is now in its third month, of India's farmers who are opposing a set of farm laws that the government rammed through Parliament with minimum discussion, and which they feel is likely to increase the stranglehold of the corporate sector on Indian agriculture. This protest has in a way shown the vulnerability of the Bharatiya Janata Party government, Mr. Modi himself, in areas where they assumed they were quite strong, like in Western UP, in Haryana. So I would say that, when people see that their rights are under attack, they do stand up to defend them. And in doing so, they also make connections that, of solidarity, connections of making common cause, which is why the government chose to go after this young environmentalist activist, because what the government fears the most is solidarity across sections. So if there's a farmers' protest, it doesn't want the environmentalists to leap in. It doesn't want students to leap in. It doesn't want women to leap in. And when they do leap in, it tries its best to criminalize those actions by saying, oh, this is a conspiracy. You guys are seditionists, you guys are anti-national. So, the long and short is that people are fighting, people are resisting. In the media, despite the enormous pressure, we run the wire without fear or favor. There are many people like us. And I would say the opposition is also giving the BJP a run for its money in several states. Unfortunately, at the national level, I would say the Congress party does not seem to have the capability or even the appetite for that kind of fight. But in West Bengal, you have a solid election on your hands. In Assam, in Kerala, all the states that are going in for elections right now, you have a good contest on the cards. So I would say both in electoral terms, the fight isn't over. There is challenge and there is contestation. And at the level of civil society, people are resisting, people are standing up for, for democratic values. And I think that how this eventually plays out depends on how resilient people will be in the face of these kinds of attacks. But I'm pretty confident.
You mentioned the farmers' protests, and they have coincided with the arrival of the Biden administration here in Washington. It was interesting because under the Trump administration, you didn't really see an emphasis on human rights really anywhere in the world, as we are well aware, not even here in the United States, many would argue. The Biden administration, during the farmers' protests, did put out a statement that talked about how access to information is a hallmark of any functioning democracy. They called for respecting the right to peacefully protest. And it was sort of a subtle shift in tone because President Biden has said he wants to revive a values-based foreign policy. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that he will pursue a very close rapport with India for all of the same strategic reasons that we have seen with respect to the US. But Mr. Nawaz, I want to direct this to you. You've seen many administrations come and go. Given the emphasis that President Biden has placed on human rights and democracy, what role do you expect the United States to play in encouraging stronger democratic values in South Asia?
I think first of all, and this may answer one of the questions that I saw come in our chat box too, you can't import democracy. You have to basically grow it at home and you have to nurture it. And that requires people like Shahidul Alam and like Siddharth, people who are there, who are fighting the fight. And it requires politicians who believe in democracy and who don't just believe in lining their own pockets. So it's very critical that whatever form of democracy emerges is homegrown, because that is what most people want. They want their voice to be heard. I mean, I've traveled in Pakistan extensively, whether it's Fatah, or whether it's Swat, whether it's talking to the Hazara in Balochistan, or in Sindh, or in Karachi and the Punjab. Everyone basically wants the same things. They want security, they want the ability to get their children educated, they want good health and education, and they want to be able to have jobs for their kids. And all the countries in the region, except maybe for Bangladesh, both India and Pakistan have been losing jobs. And so particularly after COVID, this is going to be a huge challenge. So that's something for the countries themselves, societies, to come together and address. And I think the business community needs to get its act together instead of becoming parasites or allies of governments or the military. In order to get ahead, they need to see themselves as being the vanguard of civil society and tie up with the middle class, which is an important element in all three countries, the middle class. They have the wealth, they have the education, and they have the background to be able to create a democratic superstructure that will keep the countries going. On a point that Siddharth made, I think elections are going to be critical, particularly in India. And it's interesting that the BJP only has a clear majority in 10 of the 29 states of the union. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the 4 states that are coming up for election now, to see what that shift does to the control and the ability of the central government. The same in Pakistan. I think the provincial assemblies if they start asserting their constitutional strength and start recognizing that plurality is a strength and not a weakness, so that different sectarian divisions that have been created sometimes by the government and government agencies are set aside, then I think you may find the centripetal forces much stronger than the centrifugal forces that are affecting countries like Pakistan or like India, for that matter. So I think there is hope. I wouldn't say that there isn't, but I wouldn't count on the United States coming in with a long-term vision, because the US, unfortunately, has shown an inability to craft a long-term vision. There's no over-the-horizon thinking, whether it's a Democratic government or a Republican government. They quite often have very short-sighted goals. They're tied to domestic issues, and domestic elections come every 2 years. And so the next election is already upon us with the completion of the presidential election and that cycle. In Virginia, we have an election this year. That's going to be a litmus test. So all the attention will be on that. In terms of the US pressuring India, I think if there is any effect of that, it'll be behind the scenes, and it'll primarily be on issues like Kashmir, to try and get the Indians and Pakistanis to talk to each other. But I think, again, India and Pakistan have much more at stake to talk to each other than to wait for the Americans to come in and create a forum for them to talk to each other.
Dr. Alam, did you want to chime in on that? And what I'll do is, in the interest of time, ask each of you as well for a closing thought, a brief closing thought, as we bring this, what has been a fascinating discussion, to a close. Dr. Alam, I'll begin with you, and if you wanted to respond to any of the points that Mr. Nawaz was just making as well.
Well, essentially, I'd like to point out, I mean, this subcontinent has such wealth. It's crazy that we should be in the situation that we're in. I mean, I recognize that Bangladesh has done well economically, but the entire region can do well, and just better trade between us offers so much hope for all of us. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. I quite agree with Shuja Nawaz. And the US certainly can't lead by example. So let's leave that out of it. But we don't need to be waiting for other people to be doing it. Really, collaboration between us is enough. I mean, India talks about Bangladeshi migrants going to India. The number of Indians working illegally in Bangladesh is phenomenal. That's trade. You know, we have a need. These things happen because there is a need at a particular level. And I think merely facilitating what we can do for each other. Part of the problem, of course, is that politicians by their nature think short term. They think in electoral terms rather than long-term decisions which help the community. You know, of course, one of the arguments that's often made, and I see that in one of the questions, is, you know, will Bangladesh do better if there is a change of regime and things like that? I think it's the wrong question. I don't think a change of regime is the answer. Change of process is the answer. And if we do have, and I agree with Shuja Nawaz there, and that applies both to all three countries, better transparency, better accountability will make a difference. But I do feel underneath all of that, I mean, India, despite all the things it says, we don't have a Wired, we don't have a Scroll, we don't have a Caravan in Bangladesh. We do need it. I'm happy that those things are there. I'm happy that the sort of protests that can happen by the farmers can happen in India despite all of this. For me, I worry that, you know, you can have protests in the United States, you can have protests in Belarus, you can have protests in neighboring Myanmar, yet our people are too scared to come out into the streets, and that has to happen.
Mr. Varadarajan, do you want to have a closing thought? And I do see someone had asked you if about just the BJP's control, which I think gets at what you've talked about today over both the judiciary as well as academic institutions and the press, how that can be corrected. If you want to take the opportunity to kind of give a final thought on those themes, which I know are very nuanced, but please.
But very quickly, I would say that, you know, what I said at the beginning, that there is a crisis of, you know, institutional accountability in India. And the fact is that the judiciary is not playing the kind of role that it ought to play. The media is not playing the kind of role it ought to play. And academia is under pressure because of all kinds of appointments and because of, essentially, governments dictating, who can be hired, who can't be hired, what should be taught, what shouldn't be taught. Now, all of these things, I can say that at the level of media and academia, these pressures are being resisted, and they will continue to be resisted, I think. So the government will not have a cakewalk. But what worries me is what's happening at the judiciary. It's become very unpredictable, when a case is filed as to when it will be taken up, what kind of treatment will it get. And honestly, it's hard to say how that is going to go. I am not too optimistic about the judiciary asserting its independence in a very robust fashion. But just closing thoughts, I want to tie this to, because it, based on the fact that this is an American audience and you have a new president, we have noticed that Biden's and the Biden administration's statements are different in tone and tenor from what we heard during Trump's time. And I can say that they do cause some amount of discomfiture in the government here. They aren't used to hearing some of these thoughts and statements. And to the extent to which they serve as a reminder to the government of India of the fact that, India's standing in the world has a lot to do with the fact that it is associated with democratic values. Then protecting those values and ensuring that those values aren't diluted is part of upholding India's national interest. It shouldn't require a foreign government or a foreign leader to point out certain things. I think India is, shortchanging its own people when it goes against its own constitutional principles and guarantees. And, while statements that the EU or the US may make may give some kind of hope to people in India that the Modi government has limited maneuvering room globally, but the real fight for defending those rights it has to happen in India and has to be waged by people in India and by Indians themselves. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Mr. Nawaz, a closing thought from you, and I suppose what would you want our audience to fundamentally take away from this discussion?
Sabrina, for those that know me, I'm a congenital optimist. And so I see opportunities galore, particularly in South Asia. And in fact, I'm on the record as saying that at a time when everyone thought that the 21st century was going to be the Chinese century, I have been saying consistently that if they can get their act together, the governments of South Asia can make South Asia the center of gravity of the global economy. And I think that is still possible. And that will allow essentially the 50% or higher size of the informal economy in all these countries to become part of the formal economy, and not only within their own countries, but in the neighboring countries, so that Greater South Asia as a single economic entity offers the best opportunity where you can grow and develop these societies in spite of government, and thereby wrest control back from the civil and the military institutions that have wanted to control these elements. So one element in this, and this is really in the hands of the people and the governments of all the countries that we talked about today, is my pet project, which is to revive a new Grand Trunk Road initiative that links Kabul to Dhaka, because everything exists to make it happen. I've talked to businessmen in the different countries, and they're all ready to make it happen. It's a question of the capitals allowing it to happen and the babus allowing it to happen. And if that happens, you don't have to rely on foreign aid or assistance. You've got enough wealth within the country, and much of it will be flowing back from the Middle East, particularly to Pakistan and Bangladesh, as the Middle Eastern economies shift. So I think there's hope. And I'm hoping that with that economic emancipation, the people will be able to take back control of their countries and their assemblies and hold their politicians accountable.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I know we have so many great questions, and it's always the case that you run out of time. I could carry this discussion on for hours if it were up to me, but there will be a link available online for everyone to go back and watch. So a big thank you to all of our panelists for joining us and for your insightful and profound thoughts that you have left us with. I'm now going to introduce Ambassador Islam Siddiqui, who is also the president of AMI, for closing remarks.
Can you hear me, Sabrina?
Yes, we can. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabrina, for a very wonderful panel. I want to thank everyone joining us. There are people, more than 100 people from about 5 different time zones. And there are some of our coalition partners who are very much interested in human rights and religious freedom, not only in the US, but all over the world. And that was one of the themes which triggered our thinking in terms of organizing this webinar, because we want to hear, after 4 years of Trump administration, where we saw our free press, freedom of press and freedom of judiciary was tested. But thank goodness that with the election results in November, we saw a turn for the better, where this administration, the Biden administration, is pushing for, they're going to challenge both our friends, our enemies, for practicing human rights. And if you don't, there'll be some consequences, as you're seeing just this week with Saudi Arabia. So coming back to my job, which is not to talk about what has already been covered, I want to not only thank our viewers who are here, who dialed in, but I also want to thank our distinguished panels, Shahidul Alam Sahab, Siddharth Rajan, as well as Shuja Nawaz, for their excellent presentation and their excellent subject matter expertise. Of course, we could not have done it without the help of Sabrina Siddiqui as a moderator. As always, Sabrina, you have been wonderful to work with, and we appreciate your agreeing to do this job, and you did it wonderfully. If you like this event, we encourage you to visit our website, www.americanmusliminstitution.org, to learn more about AMI and our programs, and also watch the videos of our past events. The video of this event will be posted on YouTube, and if you liked it, please share it with your friends. And at the closing, I want to wish you, please stay safe and healthy. And thank you once again.